Hello, this is now the second part of a video reaction to Altsimplified channel on the video entitled The Economy of the Philippines, Asian Tiger or Underperformer. Praise be to God Almighty. Now, concerning the six other minor points that Altsimplified presented that characterizes the Philippine economy that we mentioned earlier. One, on the idea that the Philippines took on a different economic model from the usual agricultural economy, leading to the growth of the manufacturing sector, and then to the creation of the service sector, where the Philippines, from the agriculture economy, rapidly grew its service sector before it could even develop its manufacturing sector and then traverse the income curve and make a dent on income levels, so that by the 1980s, the service sector had become the largest sector in the economy, and yet the manufacturing sector could not provide the needed jobs for the people. Yes, that is true, but Outsimplified must understand that it is not just a matter of economic model. An economic model that naturally occurred in the Philippine economy in those days. In fact, it was a matter of design. The Philippine economy by political policy was made not that way. In political economy, the idea is called neoliberalism. The government that was established in the Philippines after the war did not create itself. It and the system that it used was created by a specific political interest. The Belt Trade Act, the Treaty of General Relations, the Laurel-Langley Agreement, and the entry of the IMF World Bank itself all contributed to that neoliberal setup. If the Philippines did not industrialize back then, it was because some powerful political interests don't want it to be so. Number two, Alt simplified zeroed in on the Philippine geography and cited it as a factor specifically on the difficulty of transportation and the difficulty to transport people, resources, and logistics, as well as it contributes to the high price of electricity. Well, of course, we can only adapt to our geography, isn't it? Number three, Alt simplified cited the phenomenon of urban migration and highlighted the high population density of Manila and the high composition of low-skilled workers in the demographics producing the high unemployment rate, which is again detrimental to the economy as a whole. Well, we said earlier that if Alt Simplified would study it, the phenomenon of urban migration really began after the war and during the reconstruction of Manila and other cities. The US Congress should be commended, of course, for releasing the 560 million War Rehabilitation Fund for the reconstruction of Manila and for jump-starting the economy of the Philippines. Though it was a far cry from the 15 billion US dollar Grand Marshall Plan that went to Europe and that its release was preconditioned on the provisions that created the neoliberal post-war economy of the Philippines, is still that fund that they released did the job well. The drawback, however, was that the Philippine government established by the Americans after giving independence was not equipped with the vision, nor was it prepared to handle the people who would come from the provinces to participate in the reconstruction of the city and who would eventually establish the shanty towns or slums in and around Manila. What even made the urban migration worse was the violence never really ended after the war. Communist guerrillas called the Hawks proliferated until 1954, and then they were revived in 1968 by the New People's Army. These factors contributed a lot to the high rate of urban migration and the proliferation of slums in Manila, and what Altsimplified referred to as the lowest in the Philippine service sector. In truth, it was even Ferdinand Marcos who tried to address their plight when in 1978 he also created the Ministry of Human Settlement and the National Housing Authority. But it was already 1978. By that time, his stay in power was already numbered, and that they had already grown too large for him to handle. Number 4, Alt-Simplified zeroed in on the Philippines itself, which used to be a former US colony. Alt-Simplified was obviously very proud of this, stating this to be positive to the Philippines because of the cultural affinity with which the Filipinos identify themselves with, specifically to the West. Of course, the American influence in the Philippines did not end in 1946. Now, one sector that Alt-Simplified cited which was beneficial to the Philippine economy in relation to this was the business process outsourcing industry, or the call centers, which according to Alt-Simplified only used to be a $1 million industry in 2003, but has now grown to become a $25 billion a year industry. And although it still holds a lot of promise, but the advent of artificial intelligence in the service sector industry poses a threat to it that the Philippines should address. Well, of course, the Philippines should address that. Number 5, that Alt-Simplified zeroed in concerns the overseas Filipino workers and the remittance they bring back to the country, which according to his data accounts to about 9% of the economy, and that 1 out of 10 Filipinos work abroad as an OFW, and that the Philippines rank as the 4th largest supplier of overseas contract worker after China, India, and Mexico. Alt-Simplified attributes this to the fact that the Philippine government could not provide higher wages for its own people, and that the country's own educational system itself was designed to produce workers that would fill in the global demand for cheap labor. Well, that is true. In fact, looking at it in a moral and social standpoint, that should not be a state policy or a government policy. That is tantamount to exporting labor instead of exporting goods. But to give Alt-Simplified a reference to this overseas Filipino workers phenomenon, when Ferdinand Marcos sought the audience of the Organization of Islamic Conference, Muammar Gaddafi in particular, in trying to find a solution to the Mindanao conflict, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was part of the audience. Since the kingdom was booming at that time, during the 1970s, it was suggested that they might need people to work in their oil fields. That was when, from trying to find solution to the Mindanao conflict, Marcos fielded in people and developed his labor diplomacy policy. And since then, other administrations followed that policy. And from Saudi Arabia, Filipino workers started to be dispersed to many other parts of the world. But then the biggest contributing factor, however, why it persisted and became an ingrained institutional phenomenon in the Philippine economy was the economic crisis that gripped the Philippines from 1983 to 1992. During Marcos' time, he maximized the credit facility provided by the IMF World Bank. And through, Marcos implemented many projects loaned from the IMF World Bank. These projects produced dams, or these loans produced dams, roads, bridges, government buildings, airports, and so on. But he did this so he can maintain himself in power. While doing so, government debt ballooned. Now, when the assassination of Senator Aquino happened in 1983, everything snapped for him. The Philippine economy nosedived and the GDP started to flatline. By 1996, he was ousted from power. But instead of attaining peace, the administration of Cory Aquino became the most violent and unstable administration of all. There were a total of 9 coup attempts staged against her government. If not for the US bases and the US government at her back, she would have been toppled by military rightist rebels. It was in her administration that the Philippine GDP hovered in negative territory and the Filipino people suffered the most degree of poverty. In fact, it was also under her administration that the same IMF World Bank labeled the Philippines as the sick man of Asia. The Filipino people had no recourse but to work abroad or to completely migrate outside the country to survive. Lucky for the Filipino people that her term of office had to end. So, when the one who succeeded her, Fidel B. Ramos, assumed office, being a military general himself, the violence stopped. But then, the damage to the Philippine economy had already been done. The government had no money and had to start from scratch. Fidel B. Ramos had to borrow money from Japan just in order to build one simple flyover along EDSA, and then he even had to come up with a law called Build, Operate, Transfer Law. This law is the one in which private entities, mostly foreign, can build project in the Philippines at their own cost and then operate it and profit from it, and then at a certain period of time, based on the contract, transfer the ownership to the Philippine government. That's how the government managed to survive. And that is how, though it was not a matter of policy, but a matter of necessity, made the overworker an institutional part of the economy. Number 6, Altsimplified zeroed in on tourism and the natural beauty of the Philippines, which accounts to 12% of the country's GDP, and believed it to be one of the country's key growth areas. However, transportation and logistics problems caused the country to lag behind its neighbors, in spite it is supposed to benefit from the middle class population of its more affluent East Asian neighbors. Well, perhaps, but we will handle it slowly but surely in accordance to our own timing. Now, as to what the Philippines should focus on too, I'll simplify as the following unsolicited advice. 1. The Philippines suffers from a bad reputation, ranking 95th overall in the World Economic Forum's list of countries on the ease of doing business, behind its more affluent neighbors. In this regard, the government should implement policies or laws that would simplify doing business. And of course, the Philippine government really should. Number two, that the government should strive more to attract foreign direct investment. And as the Philippines also lags behind its neighbor in this category, Altsimplified again attributes the culprit to the country's policy of protectionism, yet again. It didn't come to the mind of Altsimplified that the repercussion when he said that the Philippines defaulted on its foreign debt in the 1980s, well, it resulted on the IMF World Bank not actually sanctioning but actually imposing a restructuring and tutelage program for the Philippines. And by 1995, the three-pronged policy of liberalization, deregulation, and privatization had to be implemented by the Philippine government. The government deregulated the price of imported oil by eliminating the tariff on it called the OPSF. The government sold and privatized many government-owned and controlled corporations, including the former military bases. The government privatized public utilities such as water and electricity. And most of all, the government joined the different trade blocs such as the WTO and the APEC. So yeah, sure. Number three, that the government should streamline the bureaucracy and further eliminate regulations to make it more competitive. Well, talk of Keynesian economics. What is Keynesian economics anyway? So yeah, sure. Number four, that the government should amend the 1987 Constitution because apparently it is one of the most restrictive constitutions in the region, citing two of its weaknesses. One, on the corporate income tax, which accordingly was the highest in ASEAN. Number two, on the complete foreign ownership of public utilities. On the corporate income tax issue, the Philippine Congress had just passed in 2020 the Corporate Income Tax Incentives Rationalization Act, or CITIRA. We are getting on that direction and doing it slowly but surely. On the issue of amending the 1987 Constitution and allowing the complete foreign ownership of public utilities, well, those are public utilities. We still give it to the wisdom of our lawmakers to decide. But as far as this blogger is concerned, inasmuch as I believe that public office is public trust, therefore, public utilities also should be publicly owned. And in this society, who does represent the public? The government, of course. Altsimplified also faulted the 1987 Constitution, saying it is one that is being used, or it is the one that is being used by the entrenched oligarchy in the country, who themselves have benefited the most from the economy, and again from its protectionist policies, and supposedly are the ones behind the huge income inequality between the rural and the urban demographics of the country. Altsimplified doesn't understand that there has been a lot of move to change that constitution, called charter change, since 1998. Even President Duterte right now, with his enormous mandate from the people and with his political will, created a council just to do that. He even promised it in his 2016 campaign. But then again, sometimes people need only to believe in the timing prescribed by God. And as concerns the high income inequality with the rural and urban demographics of the country, which is measured in Gini coefficient, which Altsimplified blamed also on the oligarchs. Well, that is partly true, and that is only partly true because Altsimplified never really considered the political economy of neoliberalism, or perhaps he knew nothing about it. That was why he was using some data supplied or perhaps coming from the IMF World Bank. We have mentioned this over and over again in this presentation. We said that the Philippines never really managed to become industrialized by intent. And again, we see outside the urban cities are vast agricultural lands that are often left undeveloped or neglected by past Philippine governments. We also see that up to now, although they are already waning, there are still communist armed rebels roaming in the Philippine countrysides. For the last 52 years, these people have pushed many poor rural Filipinos to migrate to the urban areas because of the conflict they create. Simplified must also understand that there is a cultural and educational element to economic emancipation, and that this cultural and educational element to economic emancipation takes time. Simplified also should consider the political upheavals, the social and political instability that the Philippines had gone through, including the martial law years, the communist and Muslim insurgency, the 1986 and 2001 people power that toppled two presidency. Then add to that are the natural calamities that visit the country every now and then. Simplified should also bear in mind that the current Philippine economy is driven by consumption. It means productivity and the rising GDP is pushed by consumer spending or by consumer demand. It should also understand that the present set of Philippine conglomerates now active in helping the Philippine government with a lot of projects, infrastructure projects in fact, are the ones responsible for the rise of new central business districts in and around Manila. These conglomerates uh, did not used to exist before, around 20 to 25 years ago. In fact, it was only in 2007 when the Philippine GDP started to grow remarkably and sustainably. And it was only in 2014, during a World Economic Forum meeting in Manila, that former President Benigno Aquino III stated that the IMF World Bank should already drop its label on the Philippines being the sick man of Asia, which the IMF World Bank labeled to the Philippines during the term of her mother, Cory Aquino. Imagine the crisis that resulted in the labeling of the Philippines as the sick man of Asia happened in between 1983 to 1992. And it was only in 2014 when the former President Benigno Aquino appealed that the IMF World Bank should already drop that label. So here, these are the real things, the real case of the Philippines that Altsimplified should have also seen. To God be the greater glory. Amen.